You're listening to Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
That is James MENNIE over at the Montreal Gazette. So, Jim, you mentioned here Trudeau is the gift that just keeps on giving to François Legault. What did he do today?
Well, what he did is something he's been doing for years now, and that was that we had, we all covered this press conference that had, count them, four cabinet ministers complaining about the fact, and justifiably so, that 55% of the asylum seekers coming to Canada are stuck in Quebec, which has 22% of the nation's population, and now the Trudeau's tab, which we have been covering, in fact, over the course of the years, now stands at more than $1 billion. In fact, it has become so off the charts that when you've got here's Bernard Dionville saying, education system is about to collapse because we don't have the capacity to teach these kids French. You've got basically the Legault government in a completely, which loves to look for scapegoats, but here it doesn't need it because simply by telling the truth, by pointing out that the immigration system or the immigration policy of the Trudeau government from the day one has been to determine whether or not the tweet or meme got a lot of likes online, okay, that there is no backup, there is no, all those pesky details, like accommodating people here, finding them jobs, giving them, allowing them, asking them in, and then giving them some place to stay. All that seems to have been somebody else's job, or in this case, the job of the provinces. Quebec is holding the bad end of the stick here. Their calls for complete control over immigration all of a sudden don't sound so pompous because clearly Ottawa is asleep at the switch. The press conference today that we saw today about the idea that Quebec is swamped with asylum seekers is a made-to-measure campaign ad for Pierre Poilievre. And indeed, it's a made-to-measure ad for Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, the Parti Québécois. And they have no one to thank for this but Justin Trudeau, whose own government, whose own cabinet ministers will, once they're pushed often enough, will say, yeah, things are kind of out of control. We've got to take a look and see what we're doing here because it's not working. You're damn right it's not working. And the real problem here is immigrants suddenly, no matter how broad-minded you think you are, when you see that actual systems of government or actual systems of public services are being compromised because someone's asleep at the switch in Ottawa in terms of letting people into the country, you're going to have a situation where people who are otherwise, indifferent to the issue of immigration will suddenly become very concerned about the issue of immigration, and maybe not in a positive way. Especially now we're confronted with economic uncertainty. There's a housing crisis right across the country, and indeed in Quebec and in Montreal. And people are going to start simply by deduction saying, well, gee, maybe it's because we have too many immigrants. And when that step gets taken, when that sentence enters the vernacular of public debate, I think we're all in for some problems. And the reason we're on the verge of that, as far as I'm concerned, is because of the absolute indifference and incompetence of the Trudeau government.
But Jim, when this story first came up and you look at the numbers, and yes, it's a lot of money, and yes, Quebec has to put it out, and it's a strain, obviously, on social assistance, et cetera. All the feds have to do is simply acknowledge the fact that they will pay Quebec. It's not as if they haven't paid anything going up front, right? They paid some money for this, just not what the government says they owe. Isn't that a quick fix to this problem?
Well, the quick fix would obviously be putting the money up front, but guess what? Ottawa is so busy up to its eyeballs in spending how many millions on the ArriveCan app? How many crises right now is this federal government dealing with that all of a sudden the immigration, quote unquote crisis is on the back burner? It's becoming absolutely ridiculous. And we're not even talking about abstracts. Did this overpriced app work? We're talking about people's lives here. We have politicians complaining today, and politicians will point the fingers at each other, but there are still people who, for better or for worse, believed the tweeted promise of Justin Trudeau, only to discover that not one molecule of it is true. That they're hitting a wall in terms of having their claims processed, in terms of actually settling here. It really makes anyone involved in this process extremely cynical. And when you turn around and you're handing, as I say, in the first instance, the Legault government a great big fat baseball bat to hit you over the head with in terms of your management, your claim that, we're in charge of immigration, okay, except for certain economic immigration, you can have your hands on that. But the asylum seekers, that's our job, and here we are. It's once again appears to be out of control. And quite frankly, why should Quebec be chasing Ottawa for money on what is essentially a federal responsibility? There's something there that doesn't quite add up.
Fair enough. All right, let me move from that to this other story, which I'm not familiar with. A Quebec tax to support local journalism. What's this about?
The CSN put an open letter in the Journal de Montreal today suggesting that if they want to help, finance local reporting, because that's the big thing. Everyone wants to have local reporting. Well, what you do is they call it the sort of info tax. And what it would be is a built-in 2% tax on the sale of tablets, on the sale of laptops, on the sale of desktop computers.
Okay.
In other words, create a fund that would support, i.e., local news. My concern with that is, and I have an overall concern with government paying for news coverage, is that one, we're already facing, generally we are facing something of a crisis in confidence when people hear government-supported media, news media. And the other thing is, and I discovered this back in the early days, those early Wild West days of the internet, people don't want to pay for anything online. They don't want to pay for music. They don't want to pay for content. They sure as hell don't want to pay for news. So I have a sneaking suspicion this is going to die on the operating table in terms of being an idea. But quite frankly, paywalls, some people will go through the motions, but most people don't. And I think perhaps maybe it's time to start really rethinking how to finance local media, because quite frankly, the association with government, I think, is doing more harm than good. And in the end, even as we see the number of outlets dwindle, is it a matter of simply, a lack of content or a lack of money, or even more dangerously, quite frankly, is it a growing lack of interest on the part of the public in terms of what's going on around them, that they are not, how can I put it, as programmed as say, earlier generations to pay attention to the news.
Yeah, you have to wonder. It's obviously not an easy problem to solve, but I would think, Jim, I'm pretty sure I saw a story maybe last week about, again, more local papers across the province, small communities actually closing, going away altogether. So that access to local news is getting small. That window is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I think at some point, if you can't figure out what the new model is or advertising model is to sustain that kind of business, it's no one left but the government to get involved.
I know, but once again, we've come full circle, and we're back in a situation where people will say, "Do I trust this content, even though it's being paid for by the government?" And the other irony is, and I can't speak to what happened in broadcasting; I wasn't involved back then, but I remember back in the day when newspapers were making out like bandits. There was no internet, okay? When costs had to be cut, the first thing that got its throat cut was local coverage, whether it was community sports, community coverage, all of that. They tried to do it, and then all of a sudden they pulled it out. So that very sort of niche-focused neighborhood local reporting, they tried it, but that was the first thing they got rid of. And now we have this kind of legacy media, which is based on a perception of what some people think other people want to know, that dates from the 1980s. I'm not sure that still applies anymore. But the fact is, I don't think mandatory financing, paywalls, and certainly government involvement is going to help the future of my particular line of work. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel.
It's pretty grim when you lay it out that way. I think to myself, if this keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and I'm talking about traditional media, so whether it's newspaper, whether it's radio, what's local journalism will just disappear, and then no one will miss it until it's gone and ask, well, what happened? And not realize it was because of them that it's gone.
Well, there's that, and there's also the fact that by then, what anybody anywhere decides to throw up online might be perceived as local journalism. Yeah. That's the other problem.
There's the scary part.
What someone's opinion on a pothole on their street will be considered local journalism. And it'll just be the complaint, and that's it. And, they're all, once again, all governments are incompetent, and we'll move on to the next pothole. So, yeah, it's kind of sad. But once again, In the end, I said this about the Gazette when we were going through some problems a few months back. In the end, it's up to Montrealers. If we're talking about local news, it's up to Montrealers to step up. If it doesn't happen, it ain't going to happen.
James MENNIE at the Montreal Gazette. Thank you, Jim.
Matt.